Order. I will note that all members are present and ask for unanimous consent to adopt the agenda as presented.
I so move.
Second. Alrighty.
Aye.
Next item, approval of the minutes. There are two sets. We can approve these in one motion unless there are any corrections.
I'll move to approve as submitted, both sets.
Second.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Very good. All right, seeing no members of the public, we will skip ahead to item 8.1, a sign review for the Bardesano Inn and Spa. Sandra.
At your last meeting, you approved a new sign for the Bardesano Inn and Spa at the southwest corner, and it was conditioned to be lowered in height so that it was equal with the back of the sidewalk, which would have required cutting into the berm. And the applicant has submitted an alternative location so that that action isn't necessary. And what you're looking at tonight is a revised location, and that's all it is. All other aspects of the sign remain the same as approved. And the new proposed location is in the small park that's to the south of the Bardesano site. And in consideration of this location on town property, the applicant has agreed to maintain the landscaping in the park. And it's important to note that the property line, the south property line between the Bardesano and the park isn't where the vines are, but it's further back, and that those encroach somewhat onto the into the park area. In the proposed location, the sign would be located approximately 11.5 feet south of that property line, which is in alignment with the south edge of that block wall that abuts the sidewalk, and approximately 9 feet from the most southerly row of the vines, and 5 feet south of the storm drain. And it'd be in a narrow finger of landscaping between the sidewalk on Yount Street and the pathway that winds through the park. It would be brought closer to the sidewalk and the extended apron, and the distance would now be about 5 feet versus the 12 feet that was earlier approved. And this is a 6-foot tall sign, so it would be a tall sign in close proximity. Staff has two concerns with the proposed location. One is the height of that sign to the sidewalk and that apron, and also an issue that was raised by the ZBRB at its last meeting, that there may be confusion as to the allowed use of the park based on confusion as to ownership of that property, whether it's public or private. And we feel this is even heightened now that the wall would be on public property within that park. So we are suggesting a condition that the applicant pay for the time and materials for the public works staff to construct a wooden sign that identifies public park and path, and it would be similar to the other signs that are in town. It's a consistent look of the natural wood sign. And that is the item before you, and we're proposing or suggesting approval. We do not have the applicant here tonight. He's absent, but we've represented his proposal as presented.
Any questions of staff?
I've got a couple. I just want to make sure, I'm assuming this is within our purview to approve someone else's sign within the town's right-of-way, the town's property?
Yes, we will enter into an agreement before then that will go before the next council meeting by resolution that we're accepting the placement of the sign, and they are in return for consideration maintaining the park landscaping.
Okay. Does that require an encroachment permit or a permutation of?
I spoke to the town attorney, and at first they were drafting an agreement that would obligate them to maintain the landscaping in the park, and now they think they want to handle it as a license, to where we are licensing the property to them and they would, in return, do the maintenance. And there's also, I wasn't paying that close attention, but the notion of them providing a sign that would indicate for public use that seems to be one of the points that is being a recurring point is that there's some confusion the sign presents being right in the park as to the nature of the park and if it's eligible for public use, and to have them pay for a sign that would identify the park as for public and the pathway.
Okay.
And that would be a more pretty nominal cost because it's going to be a standard out at the courtyard. They have a router, and you may have seen these signs they do around town, particularly down in community centers that are wood routed signs, and it'd be something like that. That's not real ornate or anything, but certain purpose.
All right. And I saw where the two posts were, and you wouldn't know that it's in the park. Like you can't see the property line there without knowing where it is in the first place. But it does start to. I mean, it's right there at the entrance, and it helped when it was set back to. It was more attached. When they're proposing to inset it into the vineyard, so to speak. That helped to define. To kind of attach it to the inn itself. So my concern with the identification problem still stands, and my only other concerns are any type of liability the town might incur, and the costs that the town is bearing in terms of preparing any legal documents or anything to accommodate the sign. I don't think that's really within our purview to deal with anyway, but just a couple points.
One thing on that is. At the last meeting, I know the sign was to be constructed off-site and brought to the site and then placed. What I didn't know was that it's going to be buried partially into the ground. And the signs, those big ones, the walls that are flanking the entry, and then the smaller sign, when those were constructed, they were on a foundation with steel coming up and they were made in place, and this is going to be different. And I want to suggest that if there's any concern about that method of construction, that now would be the time to impose a condition as far as a geotech soil report or be provided to. That's what the building inspector is recommending, that we have a geotech engineer sign off on the method of installation.
Okay.
It's a heavy structure, and when you say liability, that would be the only if there were whatever soil failure or seismic activity or something that would get it moving somehow. It's not going to move otherwise. It's pretty massive.
Okay.
And your point too is very well taken as far as the vines from that were planted in front of the inn were allowed to blend into the park, and there's no clear line of demarcation that sort of runs together, and it's difficult to determine where the park starts. And that was okay. That was accepted as part of the landscape design, that they flow into the park. And at one point, it was thought that maybe even the vines or the park would be planted in vines too, and we went a different way. So, it's difficult to say where the park starts.
Okay. I just have one more question. As part of the license, I'm assuming that there's a limit of liability statement or a hold harmless, some kind of thing to, some instrument to free the town of any, I'm just, fast forward 6 years, I see my son climbing on that thing and jumping into traffic or something, to use an extreme example. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I could see it being an attractive nuisance of some sort, that it would be in the town's best interest to protect itself.
I have not seen the license yet. It's coming in tomorrow, and it's drafted by the town attorney, and would expect they would have one eye on liability and risk management, and we'll certainly review it for that, from that standpoint.
Okay.
If there does not appear to be anything in there, then I will ask them if that's a concern of theirs.
Could you please give me sort of a visual description of how the sign that designates this area as the park and the sign for the inn will be juxtaposed?
All right. I really cannot, because the idea of the sign for identifying it as a public park and pathway has not been, other than it will probably be this freestanding one. You know, down at the new library and sheriff's office at the corner there, it'll be something along those lines. Where exactly it would be placed, we could certainly come back to the ZDRB for some suggestions on that. I think it would serve it well to have a separate, have some distance from this, and it's not going to be sitting in front of it, of course, and it'll probably be on the other side of the path and maybe near where the post is for the mutt mitts or whatever they call them, and that other gear over there. I think there's maybe a trash can over there. Probably more to that end.
Okay.
Towards the community hall.
Thank you.
And I don't know if it was clear in the report that this structure is, you know, it's the big one, I think 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep and then 6 feet tall, and it's got illumination in front of it, uplit onto the sign. But the deal is on the placement of it. It's at a skew angle to the sidewalk, but it is, there's a drain right there, and that drain has a pipe that runs due east. So it's got to be one side of the drain or the other to work. It can't sit. If it's nudged over towards the drain, then it's going to, that pipe is going to be interfered with because it's going to be buried in the ground. So it's got to be kind of one or the other. And that was the applicant's, what they had to solve on this as far as placement, and they felt it was better off on the south side of that drain rather than the north side. And it will still be, as the ZDRB previously required, they wanted the 6 feet to be measured from sidewalk grade rather than be built up on a mound or a berm and then measured. So that'll still be the case.
Madam, any questions?
I have a small concern about the path that goes down along the side of the Bartizono property. It is so dark at night. And if there were any lights at all, the homeowners would complain. Is there any resolution to that?
To light the park or the pathway
The pathway.
associated with the sign, no.
No, it's not associated. We were just talking liability at one point.
Right. We can take that up as a separate issue from the sign and have a look at that. Part of that is that typically the pathways are not lit at night. I mean, once you get off the sidewalk and where the pathways that go along the creek and along the back of the school, and those usually are not illuminated at night.
No.
It's something we can look at. In this case, it's close to Community Hall, and but as far as that would have to be a separate issue from the sign consideration.
No questions, just comments.
I neither have questions, so I think we can go to comments and attempt to effect a motion. Rob, would you like to begin?
Yes, certainly. I felt like my concern last time was exactly the opposite direction they've gone. I really like the idea of having it blend in more, having it be more part of the building and not as detached as it was. And I felt like we worked to get around that. I like the idea of actually having kind of carve out in the hill. It made it feel like more of an attached piece. And now we're actually moving it 12 feet further away from the facility. I like the idea that it's kind of behind a retaining wall. It's all kind of part of the building. I'm really not liking the idea of moving it so far away and then also putting it on the property. So those are my primary concerns regarding it. Of course, yeah, I'd want, because of the style it's being built and having an engineer sign off on it, I think is important. But really, I don't like it out here this far away from the building.
Well, I must agree. I concur. Although I understand their rationale because they want more visibility from Washington Street and at that intersection and everything. But I really liked the idea of it sitting in that, sort of molded into the side of the berm where the vines are. I thought that would be very attractive, and I also thought it would be not that sort of defeats their purpose, which is to be more visible. So, if the majority wants to accept it, I will. But I agree with Rob. It's sort of the opposite direction that I wanted to see that sign go.
I'm going to agree with the previous two comments. I think because of the scale of the sign and the location further away from the Yaunton-Washington intersection, moving it this much further towards that intersection doesn't really, I don't think it's going to achieve the client's goals in making it that much more visible or readable from there. So I would tend to agree that I think it should go back to where we kind of worked on in the previous meeting, having it pushed back into the hill and reinforcing that identity between the sign and the inn facility, and not adding to any confusion about the public trail and the public access through that area. My preference would be to put it back where we had it.
Madam?
I agree with everybody else. It's a huge sign. And although we want the business to succeed, I've never seen a sign make a difference to a business. I've been here a long time.
Well, at the risk of piling on, I object to the proposal for two reasons. One, I think having private property on public property sets a bad precedent. And two, as has been noted here already several times, we talked at length back at our last meeting when we approved the sign and crafted a solution that mitigated its massing by lowering it into the base of the hill, having a graded slope behind it and somewhat behind the low retaining wall. This proposal eliminates all of those actions, and therefore I can't support it. So is there a motion to approve this application? So seeing no motion, it dies. We'll move on to our next item.
In the way of direction to the applicant, so in the originally approved location, that's where the ZDRB is left with this, I guess, non-action.
Yeah, I think both by our absence of taking any action and by the testimony, I think there was a clear consensus that we, as a body, continue to think our last action was the right one.
Good. Okay. This next item is the beginning stage of a noise ordinance revision that in the staff report I included as an attachment the current noise control regulations that are found in section 8.04 of the municipal code. And then they cover most types of noise. However, animal noises are found in chapter 6, which I included at the very end of this under, it's called barking dogs. And And so I included that for your reference, but basically what the concern here is, as stated in the beginning of the staff report, is this is a subjective, it's based on someone's judgment of what's too loud. And then that's when the complaint is lodged. And it gets back to a person of normal sensibilities, I think it says, is a language that finds the noise objectionable, and then they make the complaint. And this is certainly what most jurisdictions are getting away from. They are going to a more objective, metric-based type of a noise ordinance that's can be applied uniformly and through the use of noise instrument measurement instruments. Now, that's not to say that some of these, actually I think the barking dogs, the way it's written here, some jurisdictions continue to operate on somewhat of an objective basis before they go out and start measuring sound. That's not their first go-to. If you've got a barking dog and the say sheriff or planning department or whoever is called out, we can tell that it's a barking dog. We don't need to haul out gear and start measuring sound. So you may wish to consider that something along those lines, that there's a threshold at which point sound measurement is made, and it's not done in every instance. I noted the typical, in the staff report, the typical components you would find in it, well, not only noise ordinances, but usually any ordinance where they have a purpose statement, they have definitions, they talk about enforcement and violation and how you administer that. In this case, kind of the heart of the change that's being made here is we're going to set a standard for noise measurement, and I looked at a lot of other municipalities and gave a couple of examples in the staff report from Truckee and what's my other one here, Temecula. But I found them to be fairly typical as far as they're defining night and day, and they have different standards for night and day. And this is certainly can be changed, but they usually define it as day hours 7 to 10 in the 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. and then night is 10 p.m. to 7 in the morning. So they have different standards for night and day. They have different requirements or thresholds depending on land use, if it's a commercial use, if it's a residential use. Some of them have measurements for at the property line, outdoor, and within the building. So the ones that appear here, for instance, Truckee even adds a continuous noise for, if you look at this chart on the third page of the staff report, they are clumping the uses of hospital, library, religious institution, residential, school uses. Now those are all uses that you would expect some to be at the quieter end of the spectrum. And they're saying on the left side, they're going in minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 5, 1, so forth, that in the day, under the day column, you can, for a continuous period, make noise that would come up to 55 decibels at the property line, and then for 15 minutes you can make 60 decibels at the property line, and it's kind of on a sliding scale, that recognizing that some noises are short in duration and are tolerated for a brief period, and then of course they, as is typical in a lot of these noise ordinances, they just drop it by 5 decibels at night. it's the same standards, but they shave off 5 decibels for the night standard. Some of them only give 1 standard, and then they have a footnote. At night, it goes down by 5. Portland is an example of that. And then commercial uses, they get a louder noise allowance, about 10 more than the residential and other quieter uses. And then, of course, through these, there are exceptions for, we have permits we issue for special events and amplified sound. Some are allowed by use permit. If some of these wine tasting uses typically are allowed special events through the year, or I don't know, that's what we're calling them, but 4 or 5 through the year special events that they're allowed to stay open later and have functions outdoors that would probably generate more noise than typical day. And then there's a whole class of exemptions, emergency vehicles, and those are pretty standard across the board. One thing we do control that we may wish to take out of our noise ordinance and control it a different way is construction noise. And when you look at our existing ordinance, the definition of when someone can do construction, the hours of the day, the days of the week, nothing on holidays, that's all found in the noise ordinance. And there may be a better way in a separate ordinance of when that is defined rather than in the noise ordinance. Could stay in the noise ordinance, but it may be more to the point of when construction and demolition activity is allowed.
I would just interject for a moment that what it does is say when you can't make noise, it's perfectly legal to work in Yountville 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's the making of noise that's the violation.
Right, and there's been some confusion in the past because that's found its way into a condition of approval for the project to where it just says you can work these days and you can no work on weekends and no work after these hours or before these hours. And it's not in recognition of noise, it's just that's the way it is. And then, but in the noise, it kind of flows from the noise ordinance, although it's not stated in that way that it's about noise. If you were inside painting on a Saturday and a contractor making no noise.
It is stated that way because it says such that the noise therefrom
No,
referring.
I know, in the noise ordinance.
I
What
see,
I'm
you mean
saying
in the
is
conditions.
in the condition, it
I
would just
apologize.
say, don't work on Saturday. And no matter what you're doing, if you're painting or wallpapering. And there's kind of a associated impact that isn't necessarily related to noise for why we may want to do that a construction site will have parking needs on a weekend, and there's a certain amount of activity going on that on a holiday you may not want. It's like, give it a break. Let's have a holiday and not have people out at a construction site not making noise, but there anyway. So that, for other reasons, we may want to prohibit.
And I've realized I should probably not discuss that subject anymore, given my occupation,
Why?
because it could have a material effect on my business.
So, however, I will comment that in the past there was a hard and fast rule about no weekend work, no holiday work. And with the amount of construction that's happened and the building permits that we've had out there, it's frequently been advantageous to allow some level of weekend work to get a street closed up quicker, to finish off a project quicker, particularly when a project reaches the end and they're in a push to finish it. It's been allowed for those reasons. And normally at that point, they're inside doing interior types of work rather than they're not out framing and making that kind of noise. So there's been more of a tendency to allow the holiday and weekend work for reasons to provide less inconvenience to the citizens. But what I guess is being asked here is your comments on these standards as far as these decibel levels. This will mean the town buying equipment that's ANSI, it's tied to a type 2 or 3 ANSI standard, and then you also have to, and these typically run $400 to $500, these noise measurement instruments, and then you have to buy a piece of equipment that calibrates the first piece of equipment, and it's about the same amount of money.
Who will guard the guardians?
This equipment will be, in some cases, operated by the planning department, but I would expect there'll be a fair amount of use by the sheriff's department, and it will be available to them. A lot of the types of noise complaints we experience, other than construction starting too early or going too late, are related to special events or music that commercial related to commercial activities that are sort of extracurricular in nature. They not typical, and it's a party or an event going later than most people are used to. The occasional barking dog complaint, don't really get a ton of those, but it happens every now and then. But most of them are related to commercial uses and construction. Construction is easy. That's another one. We don't need to set up equipment to measure whether it's happening. You just go there and, hey, you're working too early or late. What we get is someone who is having a party, let's go to an example. The dive bar, for instance, was part of the Bardesano offering on the Wednesday night, and they had music in the past, and the opening first one was a full-blown DJ thing, and it was loud. Probably didn't need sound equipment on that one, but the subsequent events they had more muted music that was going on, and then it becomes a question of, well, is that in violation of the subjective standard, or is that an acceptable commercial use? That yes, you may hear some music off in the distance, but is that a nuisance type of a noise? And I think that's what we're really getting at here, is to allow. Tourism is our industry, and that goes along with a lot of the hotel uses we have, the wine tasting uses, and it's going to happen, and that's just what part of life here. But for it to rise to a nuisance level, we don't want that, and we want a way of determining where the line is, and is it being exceeded, and that's what this is about. So, in summary, I think what we're really getting at here is setting a standard that recognizes what we have in town, and but it's something that can be allow that to happen, but draw the line. Now these numbers you see in here, as far as decibel levels, like I say, it's like. One approach you could use is to go out and measure what the sound is all over town. Now, this is a very extensive project, and determine what our baseline is, and then start building on that and making determinations. That is pretty involved. What I noticed is throughout these ordinances that they're very much standardized around these numbers you're looking at here, where a daytime level of 55 at a property line in a residential area is the norm. They didn't have wild swings to where it became an issue of, well, where should we set our standard? It seemed as though adopting some of these standards as a starting point, and it turns out they're not working out, we can make adjustments in the future, would be the way to go. I will also note that we don't get a lot of noise complaints, and when it happens, they're kind of all at once. Somebody had a party too late they shouldn't have had, and we hear about it the next day. And admittedly, the people hosting the party said, "Oh, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. We went to 10:30 at night, and we were supposed to stop at 9 or whatever, and it just got away from us." So there again, it's not a matter of going out and measuring sound. It's like, were you supposed to stop at 9, and it's 9:30, and it's still going? Stop. Kind of a more enforcement issue than measuring sound. But every now and then there is one that comes along to where, well, that's bothering one person, but is it a nuisance? And I suppose that remedying and answering that question is what this is towards.
Well put, Bob. Thank you. Questions or comments, since we're really just forwarding comments on the council?
Yeah, I've got several things, so I'll start. Starting off with questions, one thing I was a little bit concerned with, I imagine this has to do with where I reside, but it seems like if you have a special event permit, you don't have to follow any of the sound amplification application process, which to me seems counterintuitive. I feel like if that's like a free buy, if you just went ahead and got I'd have to see if you're planning on changing the special event permit, but I like the application process here of having to say where it is, what it is going to be, the neighborhood surrounding location, et cetera, but in your sound amplifying equipment section, it says unless you have a use permit or special event permit issued by the town. So that would mean any of the events going on wouldn't have to do the application for the sound amplification permit. So is that the intent, or that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good point. When the event area went in at V Marketplace, we knew that the nature of the request was an event area, and they're going to have events and music out there and weddings and whatnot. And so that was a known, and as part of the environmental review of that, we required them to hire an acoustical engineer and to do a study of that area. And they came out and set up microphones, and what we wanted was recommendations. And so they in that case actually did ambient noise levels, and they set up microphones around the area. And I was particularly interested in the compadres music phenomena, to where on Sundays compadres would have music, and depending on whatever played into it, the air temperature or the wind direction, or sometimes it was like the band was in my front yard, and other times you really couldn't hear it at all. And that was the concern when they were proposing an event area is, well, what does it mean in terms of sound and how these buildings are arranged, and you've got sound bouncing off buildings and headed back into town. And so they made these recommendations, and the specific recommendations had to do with, two of them I can remember had to do with a maximum decibel level, and hours that they had to stop. I think it was 9 o'clock at night for a band outside in the lawn area. So in answer to your question, I think it's a good point that no special events should not just get it's open-ended, and however long and loud they want to go. We probably should impose a maximum upper limits of when to turn it off and how loud it can be even when it's on.
And I think it comes for what's brought to mind is all of the wineries or all the tasting rooms who I know when they get passed, oftentimes it's like, well, you can have 10 special events or 12 special events. Each one of those special events, I have to say, living right behind Masonry, I get, especially during the summer, a party every weekend in basically my backyard, and how that affects, like, nobody is evaluating those special events, or I don't think you guys evaluate each one of those special events. Are they going to have outdoor music? Are they just going to be projecting the music from the interior system? Like, how it's going to be, how late it's going to be, all those types of things, because they have a special event permit, not a sound amplification permit.
I think that's a great point because when they come in and get a amplified sound permit, I think it ought to be that these are what you can operate within. It's not just set up speakers and exactly what you're saying, that it's not open-ended, and that's stemmed off at permit issuance of defining what those boundaries are for both special events and sound amplification permits.
Okay. The next thing I go to is, as you mentioned, I think a lot of it tends to be that somebody had a party or an event that went too long, and somebody or a group called and complained or whatever, and by the time anybody shows up, it's 10:30 or whatever, and it's like, oh, don't do that. What exactly is the recourse? Do they get a citation? Or is it just don't do that again?
Well, I don't know that there's any standardized, way it's handled. The sheriff, they've closed down parties before. I think part of what's going to have to come out of this and the enforcement end of it is training as far as the sheriff and what they are to do when this happens. And I don't know that they go right to the citation. Usually it's a warning. You got to shut it down or tone it down. But yeah, that would be what we would need to do on our end as far as working with the sheriff and setting up a standardized way it's controlled, rather than each time is different depending on who's on duty that night, and probably a better job of making them aware of who's got a permit that weekend and who's allowed to make noise and not make noise.
Mm-hmm. And reading through it, I appreciate the existing conditions. I kind of like that because really I think what we're trying to go for here in Yountville is more of a quiet town feel. I'm not going to compare this to Nob Hill in San Francisco. I'm not going to compare this to Telegraph Hill where there's going to be partying and lots of bars going on and whatnot. But then when I saw your example was Truckee, I felt like that's probably an appropriate comparison. So I want to say I appreciate those limitations. And then my last thing is the bit under the general noise restriction number 7 and 8, I believe. The duration of the noise and its tonal or musical content. I imagine by that it's going to be another one of these subjective experiences. What comes to mind for me is I've heard radio projected from tasting rooms in town. And it's one thing when it's a band out there playing, it's another thing when suddenly I'm getting an advertisement for Viagra that's, projected over their loudspeakers. And that to me felt like I'd like some discussion or verbiage or something in there to clarify a little bit more, maybe that we're talking about music versus projected advertising or something in there.
They have, and I'm kind of new to this myself, but they have in other cities, the ones with more sophisticated noise ordinances like Portland, the basic measurement is called the A level or A scale level, where you go out and you're just measuring the decibels. And then there's a certain type of sound they call the octave band level that is the more booming, and it's reaching across octaves, and it's producing a different type of a noise, and they have a different way of measuring that at specified frequencies. And I have to look more into that to really appreciate what the equipment can do and how you go about measuring that. But we may need to put something in there that there's a couple of different types of noise. And again, I keep coming back to what our experience here. Now that may be the case to where when you're hearing one of your, the wine tasting parties or something, usually it's just somebody going too late, or it's not a quality of noise issue. Typically it's just noise. But I'll look into these different types of measurements that are made.
Yeah, I think I'd appreciate that there is a differentiation between music, and I'm not even going to say a type of music, but music and other projected sounds. And I don't mean even construction. I mean something that's projected over a loudspeaker or outside speakers. That music is one thing, but something with particular content might be evaluated in a different way. Just because you're a nice summer afternoon, it's one thing to hear music over the back fence and not worry about complaining about it. It's another thing to hear advertisements. I mean, I don't think anybody wants that as part of their community, regardless of whether they've got an amplification permit.
Okay.
That's it for me.
Good point.
I agree that we need to hone in on the special events permit and limit the extent and the intensity of the noise and try to quantify that so there's something to go off and we're not just giving them a blank check on that. For me, one of the big things besides decibel levels and the quality of noise and everything is the enforcement and how it's enforced and how it's followed up. And I don't see any language regarding that. My limited experience with other cities and counties is there being a tracking system in place to track these, you call them offenses or whatever. So, because there's always a couple entities out there that this is a recurring theme, and so and again that relates back to the enforcement language and how that's dealt with. And first offense, is it just a slap on the wrist, and then second, is there something more involved there? On page 3, there's some discussion regarding the interior noise standard. I was wondering how common that is. I don't have any experience with that. And is that triggered with any new construction, or would that be triggered with any new construction? My concern is just adding another layer of analysis to building construction. You know, in some instances we might want to do a photometric study, and in others an interior noise standard analysis, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm worried about that and when that would come into effect. And I guess I'd want to consider that further on down the road. In the Temecula standards example, I was really surprised down at the end that they have vineyards and ag in there and limiting that at 70 decibels. And I know I'm getting into the details here, but more often than not, or every year there seems to be more situations coming up where citizens that have moved into the area, and I'm not saying Yountville in particular, are complaining about wind machines and the kind of noise that emanates from vineyards and the hours that occurs. And so I don't see us adopting this chart here, but I have concerns about discussing ag in particular and contributing to that confusion for people. And so I think it's good that we have the ag exemption, the number D on page, and this is 117, under the existing language. I think that's important, and maybe even to add to that, some clarification regarding the right to farm ordinance and how that plays into this. I just think will help clarify that further on down the road for residents. And I think that wraps it up for me. Thanks.
Well put.
Who's next?
Marita.
All right. I was wondering if it was possible to do an ordinance that says that all leaf blowers must be used on Tuesday. Drive me bananas. Having been in the events business and perhaps I should recuse myself because I still am really in the events business and putting on events, but I do support that as part of the event. You know, we do always have have to get a permit to have music that is the word escapes me at the moment. But I understand completely what Rob is saying about there's a difference between broadcasting music and broadcasting commercials all over the neighborhood. That's absolutely unacceptable. And the other thing I would like to address is that I notice on all of these examples the time of day, 7 to 10 p.m. and 10 p.m. to 7. I thought in our town that we had that the ordinance stated that you couldn't have those loud noises before 8 a.m. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I would prefer that.
I did come across another ordinance. I'm not sure what state the city is in, but they were 8 to 8 was their daytime definition. There was a variation, but it surprisingly consistent otherwise of 7 to 10. I was a little, you know, like some people want to see the 9 o'clock cut off at night rather than 10 o'clock.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, I don't. Haven't really been bothered except by leaf blowers, but I do support that first of all there should be some sort of way to quantify the sound, and secondly that there should be consequences for you know, rather than just showing up and knocking on the door and saying quit it. If it's someone, and we track them, who is a constant offender, that there should be consequences, some sort of fine or something.
I will, you know, one thing that Steve emphasized in the development of this ordinance is to include the sheriff in on it, so it's not just produced in a black box somewhere and then we expect them to enforce it later. We want their participation and co-opt them from the beginning in composing this thing. So that is an important component. Enforcement may be the most important component of this ultimately.
Thank you.
Is it part of, this is an excellent report. And is it part of your thesis that we do need the equipment to measure these noises?
Yes.
Okay. And to that, I would say that we're dealing with an art form, and that even when you measure, that can be questioned. Who's holding the measurement, where, how far away, and all the rest of it. When I look back on when the sheriff has been called, there has been either fear or anger. In the case of there was a motor that ran all night, a diesel, and it made people furious. Do you remember that?
Where was it at?
Partizono.
Oh.
But the anger preceded it. And those things, I think, can be taken care of with public relations and not with equipment. On my street, twice the sheriff has been called, and in both cases, they were domestic arguments. People were afraid, not for themselves, but for the people who were involved. They were out of control. So those wouldn't even apply here. It's a little like the light thing that we went through, 10 years ago? When someone came back and said, you can't have light, it ruins everything, and other people said, no, it's a matter of safety. It's an art form.
Yeah. And it may come down to where this, well, it's hoped and intended that the use of this equipment would be less of an art form and more of a exercise in an objective measurement of sound waves, and recording that, and that there may be a whole series of steps leading up to its use to where it becomes the final instrument of arbitration of whether something's indeed happening or not happening, and you get cooperation otherwise earlier by other means. But when it comes down to is something a nuisance or not a nuisance, and we'll go record it and try to measure it, compare it against these standards.
I have concluded.
I will say, first, I entirely support updating the ordinance and introducing a measurable standard. The 4 points I would like to make in addition to that, the draft definition of real property line is going to include demising walls between condominiums and townhouses, or for that matter, floor ceiling assemblies between townhouses and condominiums. I'm very leery of the town being involved in adjudicating disputes between people who share a roof, if you will. I think that's the proper place for an association, and I don't know that there will ever be a condominium or a townhouse that there won't be an association or some sort of pre-existing legal arrangement between that shared unit. And particularly if this ordinance is adopted, it's going to reach back and touch condominiums in this town that may have been built 30 years ago. And so I think that definition needs to go back to what we already have as far as the definition of a real property boundary. Secondly, carve out an exception for pool alarms when such pool alarms are installed pursuant to the building code. If I remember correctly, that's 75 decibels, and pool doors, exterior door alarms, are one of the allowed ways to provide for protection in pools. In fact, I have a friend whose pool is protected by exterior door alarms, and I think it would be very burdensome if a neighbor could call and say, why does my neighbor's alarm go off? Well, children are moving in and out of the house, and the alarms were installed per the building code. So I think that exception needs to be referenced, even if it's broadly, nothing in this ordinance shall apply to safety alarms that are installed per some other law. I'm sure there's a more artful way to say it. Secondly, and this was also touched on earlier, the times are, in my opinion, too rigid. To me, there's a big difference between Friday night in August, 10 a.m., and 10 a.m. tonight, which will be about 2 hours past my bedtime. So I think there should be both a seasonable adjustment of the hours, maybe tying it to sunset, so we have both the days of the week, Sunday through Thursday, and perhaps something on Saturday, not an hour past sunset. But I think there needs to be some thought that, again, there's a big difference, I think, between Wednesday night and in January and a Friday night in August. It's been touched on before. I'll just say I agree that a better enforcement protocol and tracking system. And I'd also point out, particularly for the complainant, sometimes it's not the noisemaker, if you will, that's the problem, but if one can track that it's only one particular complaint in a neighborhood, you can realize that therein is a problem. As Matt mentioned, must retain the agriculture exemption, and I think there should be a Sinatra exemption as well. And those are all of my comments.
Oh, no, I disagree.
Do you need anything else?
Good comments. All down the line.
Any board reports?
Nada.
Nope. Staff reports? Unanimous consent to adjourn?
Aye.
Good night.